Chapter 6 of the Mind and Its Education by George Herbert Betts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karima Ridout. Sensation. We can best understand the problems of sensation and perception if we first think of the existence of two great worlds, the world of physical nature without, and the world of mind within. On the one hand is our material environment, the things we see and hear and touch and taste and handle, and on the other hand our consciousness, the means by which we come to know this outer world and adjust ourselves to it. These two worlds seem, in a sense, to belong to and require each other. For what would be the meaning or use of the physical world with no mind to know how to use it? And what would be the use of a mind with nothing to be known or thought about? 1. How we come to know the external world. There is a marvel about our coming to know the external world, which we shall never be able to fully understand. We have come by this knowledge so gradually and unconsciously that it now appears to us as commonplace, and we take for granted many things that would puzzle us to explain. Knowledge through the senses. For example, if we say, "Of course I see yonder green tree. It is about 10 rods distant." But why "of course"? Why should objects at a distance from us and with no evident connection between us and them be known to us at all merely by turning our eyes in their direction when there is light? Why not rather say with the blind son of Professor Prézu of Paris, who, when asked if he would like to be restored to sight, answered, "If it were not for curiosity, I would rather have long arms. It seems to me that my hands would teach me better what is passing in the moon than your eyes or telescopes." We listen and then say, "Yes, that is a certain bell ringing in the neighboring village," as if this were the most simple thing in the world. But why should one piece of metal striking against another a mile or two away make us aware that there is a bell there at all, let alone that it be a certain bell whose tone we recognize? Or we pass our fingers over a piece of cloth and decide, that is silk. But why merely by placing our skin in contact with a bit of material should we be able to know its quality, much less that it is cloth and that its threads were originally spun by an insect? Or we take a sip of liquid and say, "This milk is sour." But why should we be able to, by taking the liquid into the mouth and bringing it into contact with the mucous membrane, to tell that it is milk and that it possesses the quality which we call sour? Or, once more, we get a whiff of air through the open window and in the springtime and say, "There is a lilac bush in bloom on the lawn." Yet why, from inhaling air containing particles of lilac, should we be able to know that there is anything outside, much less that it is a flower, and of a particular variety which we call lilac? Or finally, we hold a heated flat iron up near the cheek and say, "This is too hot. It will burn the cloth." But why, by holding this object a foot away from the face, do we know that it is there, let alone knowing its temperature? The unity of sensory experience. Further, our senses come through experience to have the power of fusing, or combining their knowledge, so to speak, by which each expresses its knowledge in terms of the others. Thus, we take a glance out of the window and say that the day looks cold, although we well know that we cannot see cold, or say that the melon sounds green, or the bell sounds cracked, although a crack or greenness cannot be heard. Or we say that the box feels empty, although emptiness cannot be felt. We have come to associate cold originally experienced with days which look like one we now see, with this particular appearance, and so we say that we see the cold. Sounds, like the one coming from the bell, we have come to associate with cracked bells, and that coming from the melon with green melons, until we say unhesitatingly that the bell sounds cracked and the melon sounds green. And so with the various senses. Each gleans from the world its own particular bit of knowledge, but all are finally in partnership, and what is each one's knowledge belongs to every other one insofar as the other can use it. The sensory process to be explained. The explanation of ultimate nature of knowledge, and how we reach it through contact with our material environment, we will leave to the philosophers. And battles enough they have over the question, and still others they will have before the matter is settled. The easier and more important problem for us to describe is the process by which the mind comes to know its environment, and to see how it uses this knowledge in thinking. This much we shall be able to do, for it is often possible to describe a process and discover its laws, even when we cannot fully explain its nature and origin. We know the process of digestion and assimilation and the laws which govern them, although we do not understand the ultimate nature or origin of life which makes these possible. The qualities of objects exist in the mind. Yet, even the relatively simple description which we have proposed, many puzzles confront us, and one of them appears at the very outset. This is that the qualities we usually ascribe to objects really exist in our own minds and not in the objects at all. Take, for instance, the common qualities of light and color. The physicist tells us that what we see as light is occasioned by an incredibly rapidly beating of ether waves on the retina of the eye. All space is filled with ether, and when it is light, that is, when some object like the sun or other light-giving body is present, the ether is set in motion by the vibrating molecules of the body, which is the source of light. Its waves strike the retina. A current is produced and carried to the brain, and we see light. This means, then, that space, the medium in which we see objects, is not filled with light, the sensation, but with very rapid waves of ether, and that the light which we see really occurs in our own minds as the mental response to the physical stimulus of ether waves. Likewise with color. Color is produced by ether waves of different lengths and degrees of rapidity. Thus, ether waves at the rate of 450 billions a second gives us the sensation of red, 472 billions a second, orange, of 526 billions a second, yellow, of 589 billions a second, green, of 640 billions a second, blue, of 722 billions a second, indigo, of 790 billions a second, violet. What exists outside of us, then, is these ether waves of different rates, and not the colors as sensations themselves. The beautiful yellow and crimson of a sunset, the variegated colors of a landscape, the delicate pink in the cheek of a child, the blush of a rose, the shimmering green of the lake. These reside not in the objects themselves, but in the consciousness of the one who sees them. The object possesses but the quality of reflecting back to the eye of ether waves, of the particular rate corresponding to the color which we ascribe to them. Thus, red objects, and no others, reflect back ether waves of a rate of 450 billions a second. White objects reflect all rates. Black objects reflect none. The case is no different with regard to sound. When we speak of a sound coming from a bell, what we really mean is that the vibrations of the bell have set up waves in the air between it and our ear, which have produced corresponding vibrations in the ear, that a nerve current was thereby produced, and that a sound was heard. But the sound, i.e. sensation, is a mental thing and exists only in our consciousness. What passed between this sounding object and ourselves was waves in the intervening air, ready to be translated through the machinery of nerves and brain into the beautiful tones and melodies and harmonies of the mind. And so with all other sensations. The three sets of factors. What exists outside of us, therefore, is a stimulus, some form of physical energy of a kind suitable to excite to activity a certain end organ of taste or touch or smell or sight or hearing. What exists within us is the nervous machinery, capable of converting the stimulus into a nerve current, which shall produce an activity in the cortex of the brain. What results is the mental object which we call sensation of taste, smell, touch, sight, or hearing. 2. The nature of sensation. Sensation gives us our world of qualities. In actual experience, sensations are never known apart from the objects to which they belong. This is to say, that when we see yellow or red, it is always in connection with some surface or object. When we taste sour, this quality belongs to some substance, and so on with all the senses. Yet by sensation we mean only the simple qualities of objects known in consciousness as the result of appropriate stimuli applied to end organs. We shall later see how by perception these qualities fuse or combine to form objects, but in the present chapter we shall be concerned with the qualities only. Sensations are then the simplest and most elementary knowledge we may get from the physical world. The red, the blue, the bitter, the cold, the fragrant, and whatever other qualities may belong to the external world. We shall not for the present be concerned with the objects or sources from which the quality may come. To quote James on the meaning of sensation, all we can say on this point is that what we mean by sensation are first things in the way of consciousness. They are the immediate results upon consciousness of the nerve currents as they enter the brain, and before they have awakened any suggestions or associations with past experience. But it is obvious that such immediate sensations can be realized only in the earliest days of life. The attributes of sensation. Sensations differ from each other in at least 4 respects, namely, quality, intensity, extensity, and duration. It is a difference in quality that makes us say, this paper is red, and that blue. This liquid is sweet, and that sour. Differences in quality are therefore fundamental differences in kind. Besides the quality differences that exist within the same general field, as of taste or vision, it is evident that there is still a more fundamental difference existing between the various fields. One can, for example, compare red with blue, or sweet with sour, and tell which quality he prefers. But let him try to compare red with sweet, or blue with sour, and the quality difference is so profound that there seems to be no basis for comparison. Difference in intensity of sensation are familiar to every person who prefers 2 lumps of sugar rather than 1 lump in his coffee. The sweet is of the same quality in either case, but differs in intensity. In every field of sensation, the intensity may proceed from the smallest amount to the greatest amount discernible. In general, the intensity of the sensation depends upon the intensity of the stimulus, though the condition of sense organs as regards fatigue or adaptation to the stimulus has its effect. It is obvious that a stimulus may be too weak to produce any new sensation, as for example a few grains of sugar in a cup of coffee or a few drops of lemon in a quart of water could not be detected. It is also true that the intensity of stimulus may be so great that an increase in intensity produces no effect on sensation, as for example the addition of sugar to a solution of saccharin would not noticeably increase its sweetness. The lowest and highest intensity points of sensation are called the lower and upper limen, or threshold, respectively. By extensity is meant the space differences of sensations. The touch of a point of a toothpick on the skin has a different space quality from the touch of the flat end of a pencil. Low tones seem to have more volume than high tones. Some pains feel sharp and others dull and diffuse. The warmth felt from spreading the palms of the hands out to the fire has a bigness not felt from heating one solitary finger. The extensity of a sensation depends on the number of nerve endings stimulated. The duration of a sensation refers to the time it lasts. This must not be confused with the duration of the stimulus, which may be either longer or shorter than the duration of the sensation. Every sensation must exist for some space of time, long or short, or it would have no part in consciousness. 3. Sensory qualities and their end organs. All are familiar with the 5 senses of our elementary physiologies: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. A more complete study of the sensation reveals nearly 3 times this number, however. This is to say that the body is equipped with more than a dozen different kinds of end organs, each prepared to receive its own particular type of stimulus. It must also be understood that some of the end organs yield more than one sense. The eye, for example, gives not only visual but muscular sensations. The ear, not only auditory but tactical. The tongue, not only gustatory but tactical and cold and warmth sensations. Sight. Vision is a distance sense. We can see afar off. The stimulus is a chemical in its action. This means that the ether waves on striking the retina cause a chemical change which sets up the nerve current responsible for the sensation. The eye, whose general structure is sufficiently described in all standard physiologies, consists of a visual apparatus designed to bring the images of objects to a clear focus on the retina in the foeva, or area of clearest vision, near the point of entrance of the optical nerve. The sensation of sight coming from this retinal image, unaided by other sensations, gives us but 2 qualities: light and color. The eye can distinguish many different grades of light, from purest white on through the various grades to the densest black. The range is greater still in color. We speak of the 7 colors of the spectrum: violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. But this is not a very serviceable classification, since the average eye can distinguish about 35,000 color effects. It is also somewhat bewildering to find that all these colors seem to be produced from the 4 fundamental hues: red, green, yellow, and blue, plus the various tints. These four, combined in varying proportions and with different degrees of light, i.e. different shades of gray, yield all the color effects known to the human eye. Herschel estimates that the workers on mosaics at Rome must have distinguished 30,000 different color tones. The hue of a color refers to its fundamental quality, as red or yellow. The chroma to its saturation or strength of the color, and the tint to the amount of brightness, i.e. white, it contains. Hearing. Hearing is also a distance sense. The action of its stimulus is mechanical, which is to say that the vibrations produced in the air by the sounding body are finally transmitted by the mechanism of the middle ear to the inner ear. Here the impulse is conveyed through the liquid of the internal ear to the nerve endings as so many tiny blows, which produce the nerve current carried to the brain by the auditory nerve. The sensation of hearing, like that of sight, gives us two qualities, namely, tones with their accompanying pitch and timbre, and noises. Tones or musical sounds are produced by isochronos, or equal timed vibrations. Thus, C of the first octave is produced by 256 vibrations a second, and if this tone is prolonged, the vibration rate will continue uniformly the same. Noises, on the other hand, are produced by vibrations which have no uniformity of vibration rate. The ear's sensibility to pitch extends over about 7 octaves. The 7-octave piano goes down to 27.5 vibrations and reaches up to 3,500 vibrations. Notes of nearly 50,000 vibrations can be heard by an average ear. However, these are too painfully shrill to be musical. Taking into account this upper limit, the range of the ear is about 11 octaves. The ear, having given us loudness of tones, which depends on the amplitude of vibrations, pitch, which depends on the rapidity of the vibrations, and timbre or quality, which depends on the complexity of the vibrations, has no further qualities of sound to reveal. Taste. The sense of taste is located chiefly in the tongue, over the surface of which are scattered many minute taste bulbs. These can be seen as small red specks, plentifully distributed along the edges at the tip of the tongue. The substance tasted must be in solution and come in contact with the nerve endings. The action of the stimulus is chemical. The sense of taste recognizes 4 qualities of sour, sweet, salt, and bitter. Many of the qualities which we improperly call tastes are in reality a complex of taste, smell, touch, and temperature. Smell contributes so largely to the sense of taste that many articles of food become tasteless. When we have a catarrh and many nauseating doses of medicine can be taken without discomfort if the nose is held. Probably none of us, if we are careful to exclude all odors by plugging the nostrils with cotton, can, by taste alone, distinguish between scraped apple, potato, turnip, or beet, or can tell hot milk from tea or coffee of the same temperature. Smell. In the upper part of the nasal cavity lies a small brownish patch of mucous membrane. It is here that the olfactory nerve endings are located. The substance smelled must be volatile, that is, it must exist in gaseous form and come in direct contact with the nerve endings. Chemical action results in a nerve current. The sensations of smell have not been classified so well as those of taste, and we have no distinct names for them. Neither do we know how many olfactory qualities the sense of smell is capable of revealing. The only definite classification of smell qualities is that based on their pleasantness or the opposite. We also borrow a few terms and speak of sweet or fragrant odors and fresh or close smells. There is some evidence when we observe animals, or even primitive men, that the human race has been evolving greater sensibility to certain odors, while at the same time there has been a loss of keenness to what we call scent. Various sensations from the skin. The skin, besides being a protective and excretory organ, affords a lodging place for the end organs, giving us our sense of pressure, pain, cold, warmth, tickle, and itch. Pressure seems to have for its end organ the hair bulbs of the skin. On hairless regions, small bulbs, called the corpuscles of Meissner, serve this purpose. Pain is thought to be mediated by free nerve endings. Cold depends on end organs called the bulbs of Krauss, and warmth on the Ruffinian corpuscles. Cutaneous or skin sensation may arise from either mechanical stimulation, such as pressure, a blow or tickling, from thermal stimulation from hot or cold objects, from electrical stimulation or the form of action of certain chemicals, such as acids and the like. Stimulated mechanically, the skin gives us but two sensation qualities, pressure and pain. Many of the qualities which we commonly ascribe to the skin sensations are really a complex of cutaneous and muscular sensations. Contact is light pressure. Hardness and softness depend on the intensity of the pressure. Roughness and smoothness arise from interrupted and continuous pressure, respectively, and require movement over the rough or smoother surface. Touch depends on pressure accompanied by the muscular sensations involved in the movements connected with the act. Pain is clearly a different sensation from pressure, but any of the cutaneous or muscular sensations may, by excessive stimulation, be made to pass over into pain. All parts of the skin are sensitive to pressure and pain, but certain parts, like the fingertips and the tip of the tongue, are more highly sensitive than others. The skin varies also in its sensitivity to heat and cold. If we take a hot or very cold pencil point and pass it rather lightly and slowly over the skin, it is easy to discover certain spots from which a sensation of warmth or of cold flashes out. In this way it is possible to locate the end organs of temperature very accurately. The kinesthetic senses. The muscles, tendons, and joints also give rise to perfectly definite sensations, but they have not been named, as have the sensations for most of the other end organs. Weight is the most clearly marked of these sensations. It is through the sensations connected with movements of muscles, tendons, and joints that we come to judge form, size, and distance. The organic senses. Finally, to the sensations mentioned so far must be added those which come from internal organs of the body. From the alimentary canal we get sensations of hunger, thirst, and nausea. From the heart, lungs, and organs of sex come numerous well-defined but unnamed sensations which play an important part in making up the feeling tone of our daily lives. Thus we see that the senses may be looked upon as the sentries of the body, standing at the outposts where the nature and ourselves meet. They discover the qualities of the various objects with which we come into contact and hand them over to the mind in the form of sensations. And these sensations are raw material out of which we begin to construct our material environment. Only as we are equipped with good organs of sense, especially good eyes and ears, therefore, are we able to enter fully into the wonderful world about us, and receive the stimuli necessary to our thought and action. 4. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. Observe a schoolroom of children at work with the aim of discovering any that show defects of vision or hearing. What are the symptoms? What is the effect of inability to hear or see well upon interest and attention? 2. Talk with your teacher about testing the eyes and ears of the children of some school. The simpler tests for vision and hearing are easily applied, and the expensive material almost nothing. What tests should be used? Does your school have a test card for vision? 3. Use a rotator or colored tops for mixing discs of white and black to produce different shades of gray. Fix in mind the gray made of half white and half black, 3/4 white and 1/4 black, 1/4 white and 3/4 black. In the very same way, mix two complementaries, yellow and blue, to produce a gray. Mix red and green in the same way. Try various combinations of the 4 fundamental colors and discover how different colors are produced. Seek for the same colors in nature, sky, leaves, flowers, etc. 5. Take a large wire nail and push it through a cork so that it can be handled without touching the metal with the fingers. Now cool it in ice or very cold water. Then dry it and move the point slowly across the back of the hand. Do you feel occasional thrills of cold as the point passes over a bulb of krauss? Heat the nail with a match flame or over a lamp, and perform the same experiment. Do you feel the thrills of heat from the corpuscles of Ruffini? 6. Try stopping the nostrils with cotton and have someone give you scraped apple, potato, onion, etc., and see whether by taste alone you can distinguish the difference. Why cannot sulfur be tasted? End of Chapter 6. Sensation. Recording by Karima Ridout.
Chapter 7 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary B. Clayton. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert Beck. Chapter 7. Perception. No young child at first sees objects as we see them, or hears sounds as we hear them. This power, the power of perception, is a gradual development. It grows day by day out of the learner's experience in his world of sights and sounds, and whatever other fields his senses respond to. 1. The function of perception. Need of knowing the material world. It is the business of perception to give us knowledge of our world of material objects and their relations in space and time. The material world which we enter through the gateways of the senses is more marvelous by far than any fairy world created by the fancy of storytellers, for it contains the elements of all they have conceived and much more besides. It is more marvelous than any structure planned and executed by the mind of man, for all the wonders and beauties of the Colosseum or of St. Peter's existed in nature before they were discovered by the architect and thrown together in these magnificent structures. The material advancement of civilization has been but the discovery of the objects, forces, and laws of nature, and their use and inventions serviceable to men. And these forces and laws of nature were discovered only as they were made manifest through objects in the material world. The problem lying before each individual who would enter fully into this rich world of environment, then, is to discover at first hand just how large a part of the material world about him as possible. In the most humble environment of the most uneventful life is to be found the material for discoveries and inventions yet undreamed of. Lying in the shade of an apple tree under the open sky, Newton read from a falling apple the fundamental principles of the law of gravitation which has revolutionized science. Sitting at a humble tea table, Watt watched the gurgling of the steam escaping from the kettle, and evolved the steam engine therefrom. With his simple kite, Franklin drew down the lightning from the clouds, and started the science of electricity. Through studying a ball, the ancient scholars conceived the earth to be a sphere, and Columbus discovered America. The problem which confronts the child. Well, it is that the child, starting his life's journey, cannot see the magnitude of the task before him. Cast amid a world of objects of whose very existence he is ignorant, and whose meanings and uses have to be learned by slow and often painful experience, he proceeds step by step through the senses in his discovery of the objects about him. Yet, considered again, we ourselves are after all but a step in advance of the child. Though we are somewhat more familiar with the use of our senses than he, and know a few more objects about us, yet the knowledge of the wisest of us is at best pitifully meager compared with the richness of nature. So impossible is it for us to know all our material environment, that men have taken to becoming specialists. One man will spend his life in the study of a certain variety of plants, while there are hundreds of thousands of varieties all about him. Another will study a particular kind of animal life, perhaps too minute to be seen with the naked eye, while the world is teeming with animal forms which he has not time in his short day of life to stop to examine. Another will study the land forms and read the earth's history from the rocks and geological strata. But here again nature's volume is so large that he has time to read but a small fraction of the whole. Another studies the human body and learns to read from its expressions the signs of health and sickness, and to prescribe remedies for its ills. But in this field also he has found it necessary to divide the work, and so we have specialists for almost every organ of the body. 2. The nature of perception. How a percept is formed. How then do we proceed to the discovery of this world of objects? Let us watch the child and learn the secret from him. Give the babe a ball, and he applies every sense to it to discover its qualities. He stares at it, he takes it in his hands and turns it over and around, he lifts it, he strokes it, he punches it and jabs it, he puts it to his mouth and bites it, he drops it, he throws it, and creeps after it. He leaves no stone unturned to find out what that thing really is. By means of the qualities which come to him through the avenues of sense, he constructs the object. And not only does he come to know the ball as a material object, but he comes to know also its uses. He is forming his own best definition of a ball in terms of the sensations which he gets from it, and the uses to which he puts it, and all this even before he can name it or is able to recognize its name when he hears it. How much better his method than the one he will have to follow a little later when he goes to school and learns that, quote, a ball is a spherical body of any substance or size, used to play with, as by throwing, kicking, or knocking, etc., end quote. The percept involves all relations of the object. Nor is the case in the least different with ourselves. When we wish to learn about a new object or discover new facts about an old one, we do precisely as the child does if we are wise. We apply to it every sense to which it will afford a stimulus, and finally arrive at the object through its various qualities. And just in so far as we have failed to use in connection with it every sense to which it can minister, just in that degree will we have an incomplete perception of it. Indeed, just so far as we have failed finally to perceive it in terms of its functions or uses, in that far also have we failed to know it completely. Tomatoes were for many years grown as ornamental garden plants before it was discovered that the tomatoes could minister to the taste as well as to the sight. The clothing of civilized man gives the same sensation of texture and color to the savage as it does to his owner, but he is so far from perceiving it in the same way that he packs it away and continues to go naked. The Orientals, who disdain the use of chairs and prefer to sit cross-legged on the floor, can never perceive a chair just as we do who use chairs daily, and to whom chairs are so saturated with social suggestions and association. The content of the percept. The percept, then, always contains a basis of sensation. The eye, the ear, the skin, or some other sense organ must turn in its supply of sensory material or there can be no percept. But the percept contains more than just sensation. Consider, for example, your percept of an automobile flashing past your window. You really see but very little of it, yet you perceive it as a very familiar vehicle. All that your sense organs furnish is a more or less blurred patch of black of certain size and contour, one or more objects of somewhat different color whom you know to be passengers, and various sounds of a whizzing, chugging, or roaring nature. Your former experience with automobiles enables you to associate with these meager sensory details the upholstered seats, the whirling wheels, the swaying movement, and whatever else belongs to the full meaning of a motor car. The percept that contained only sensory material and lacked all memory elements, ideas, and meanings would be no percept at all. And this is the reason why a young child cannot see or hear like ourselves. It lacks the associative material to give significance and meaning to the sensory elements supplied by the end organs. The dependence of the percept on material from past experience is also illustrated in the common statement that one gets from an art exhibit or a concert depends on what he brings to it. He who brings no knowledge, no memory, no images from other pictures or music will secure but relatively barren percepts, consisting of little besides the merest sensory elements. Truly, "To him that hath shall be given," in the realm of perception. The accuracy of percepts depend on experience. We must perceive objects through our motor response to them as well as in terms of sensations. The boy who has his knowledge of a tennis racket from looking at one in a store window, or indeed from handling one and looking it over in his room, can never know a tennis racket as does the boy who plays with it on the court. Objects get their significance not alone from their qualities, but even more from their use as related to our own activities. Like the child, we must get our knowledge of objects, if we are to get it well, from the objects themselves at first hand, and not second hand through descriptions of them by others. The fact that there is so much of the material world about us that we can never hope to learn it all, has made it necessary to put down in books many of the things which have been discovered concerning nature. This necessity has, I fear, led many away from nature itself to books, away from the living reality of things to the dead embalming cases of words, in whose empty forms we see so little of the significance which resides in the things themselves. We are in danger of being satisfied with the forms of knowledge without its substance, with definitions contained in words instead of in qualities and uses. Not definitions, but first-hand contact. In like manner we come to know distance, form, and size. If we have never become acquainted with a mile by actually walking a mile, running a mile, riding a bicycle a mile, driving a horse a mile, or traveling a mile on a train, we might listen for a long time to someone tell how far a mile is, or state the distance from Chicago to Denver, without knowing much about it in any way except word definition. In order to understand a mile, we must come to know it in as many ways as possible through sense activities of our own. Although many children have learned that it is 25,000 miles around the earth, probably no one who has not encircled the globe has any reasonably accurate notion of just how far this is, for words cannot take the place of perceptions in giving us knowledge. In the case of shorter distances, the same rule holds. The eye must be assisted by the experience of the muscles and tendons and joints in actually covering distance, and learn to associate these sensations with those of the eye before the eye alone can be able to say, "That tree is 10 yards distant." Form and size are to be learned in the same way. The hands must actually touch and handle the object, experiencing its hardness or smoothness, the way this curve and that angle feels, the amount of muscular energy it takes to pass the hand over this surface and along that line, the eye taking note all the while, before the eye can tell at a glance that yonder object is a sphere, and that this surface is 2 feet on the edge. 3. The perception of space. Many have been the philosophical controversies over the nature of space and our perception of it. The psychologists have even quarreled concerning whether we possess an innate sense of space, or whether it is a product of experience and training. Fortunately, For our present purpose we shall not need to concern ourselves with either of these controversies. For our discussion we may accept space for what common sense understands it to be. As to our sense of space, whatever of this we may possess at birth, it certainly has to be developed by use and experience to become of practical value. In the perception of space we must come to perceive distance, direction, size, and form. As a matter of fact, however, size is but so much distance, and form is but so much distance in this, that, or the other direction. The perceiving of distance. Undoubtedly, the eye comes to be our chief dependence in determining distance, yet the muscle and joint senses give us our earliest knowledge of distance. The babe reaches for the moon simply because the eye does not tell it that the moon is out of reach. Only as the child reaches for its playthings, creeps or walks after them, and in 1,000 ways uses its muscles and joints in measuring distance, does the perception of distance become dependable. At the same time, the eye is slowly developing its power of judging distance. But not for several years does visual perception of distance become in any degree accurate. The eye's perception of distance depends in part on the sensations arising from the muscles controlling the eye, probably in part from the adjustment of the lens, and in part from the retinal image. If one tries to look at the tip of his nose, he easily feels the muscle strain caused by the required angle of adjustment. We come unconsciously to associate distance with the muscle sensations arising from the different angles of vision. The part played by the retinal image in judging distance is easily understood in looking at two trees, one 30 feet and the other 300 feet distant. We note that the nearer tree shows the detail of the bark and leaves, while the more distant one lacks this detail. The nearer tree also reflects more light and color than the one farther away. These minute differences, registered as they are on the retinal image, come to stand for so much of distance. The ear also learns to perceive distance through differences in the quality and the intensity of sound. Auditory perception of distance is, however, never very accurate. The perceiving of direction. The motor senses probably give us our first perception of direction as they do of distance. The child has to reach this way or that way for his rattle, turn the eyes or head so far in order to see an interesting object, twist the body, crawl or walk to one side or the other to secure his bottle. In these experiences he is gaining his first knowledge of direction. Along with these muscle joint experiences, the eye is also being trained. The position of the image on the retina comes to stand for direction, and the eye finally develops so remarkable a sense of perceiving direction that a picture hung a half-inch out of plumb is a source of annoyance. The ear develops some skill in the perception of direction, but is less dependable than the eye. 4. The perception of time. The philosophers and psychologists agree little better about our sense of time than they do about our sense of space. Of this much, however, we may be certain: our perception of time is subject to development and training. Nature of the time sense. How we perceive time is not so well understood as our perception of space. It is evident, however, that our idea of time is simpler than our idea of space. It has less content, less that we can describe. Probably the most fundamental part of our idea of time is progression, or change, without which it is difficult to think of time at all. The question then becomes, how do we perceive change, or succession? If one looks in upon his thought stream, he finds that the movement of consciousness is not uniformly continuous, but that his thought moves in pulses, or short rushes, so to speak. When we are seeking for some fact or conclusion, there is a moment of expectancy, or poising, and then the leap forward to the desired point or conclusion, from which an immediate start is taken for the next objective point of our thinking. It is probable that our sense of the few seconds of passing time that we call the immediate present consists of the recognition of the succession of these pulsations of consciousness, together with certain organic rhythms, such as heartbeat and breathing. No perception of empty time. Our perception does not therefore act upon empty time. Time must be filled with a procession of events, whether these be within our own consciousness or in the objective world without. All longer periods of time, such as hours, days, or years, are measured by the events which they contain. Time filled with happenings that interest and attract us seems short while passing, but longer when looked back upon. On the other hand, time relatively empty of interesting experience hangs heavy on our hands in passing, but, viewed in retrospect, seems short. A fortnight of travel passes more quickly than a fortnight of illness, but yields many more events for the memory to review as the "filling" for time. Probably no one has any very accurate feeling of the length, that is, the actual duration of a year, or even of a month. We therefore divide time into convenient units, as weeks, months, years, and centuries. This allows us to think of time in mathematical terms where immediate perception fails in its grasp. 5. The training of perception. In the physical world as in the spiritual, there are many people who, "having eyes, see not, and ears, hear not." For the ability to perceive accurately and richly in the world of physical objects depends not alone on good sense organs, but also on interest and the habit of observation. It is easy if we are indifferent or untrained to look at a beautiful landscape, a picture or a cathedral without seeing it. It is easy if we lack interest or skill to listen to an orchestra or the myriad sounds of nature without hearing them. Perception needs to be trained. Training in perception does not depend entirely on the work of the school, for the world about us exerts a constant appeal to our senses. 1,000 sights, sounds, contacts, tastes, smells, or other sensations hourly throng in upon us, and the appeal is irresistible. We must in some degree attend, we must observe. Yet it cannot be denied that most of us are relatively unskilled in perception. We do not know how, or take the trouble to observe. For example, a stranger was brought into the classroom and introduced by the instructor to a class of 50 college students in psychology. The class thought the stranger was to address them, and looked at him with mild curiosity. But after standing before them for a few moments, he suddenly withdrew, as had been arranged by the instructor. The class were then asked to write such a description of the stranger as would enable a person who had never seen him to identify him. But so poor had been the observation of the class that they ascribed to him clothes of 4 different colors, eyes and hairs each of 3 different colors, a tie of many different hues, height ranging from 5 feet and 4 inches to over 6 feet, age from 28 to 45 years, and many other details as wide of the mark. Nor is it probable that this particular class was below the average in the power of perception. School training in perception. The school can do much in training the perception, but to accomplish this the child must constantly be brought into immediate contact with the physical world about him and taught to observe. Books must not be substituted for things. Definitions must not take the place of experiment or discovery. Geography and nature study should be taught largely out of doors, and the lessons assigned should take the child into the open for observation and investigation. All things that live and grow, the sky and clouds, the sunset colors, the brown of upturned soil, the smell of the clover field or the new mown hay, the sounds of a summer night, the distinguishing marks by which to identify each family of common birds or breed of cattle, these and 1,000 other things that appeal to us from the simplest environment afford a rich opportunity for training the perception. And he who has learned to observe, and who is alert to the appeal of nature, has no small part in his education already assured. 6. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. Test your power of observation by walking rapidly past a well-filled store window and then seeing how many of the objects you can name. 2. Suppose a tailor, a bootblack, a physician, and a detective are standing on the street corner as you pass by. What will each one be most likely to observe about you? Why? 3. Observe carefully green trees at a distance of a few rods, a quarter of a mile, several miles. Describe differences: 1. In color, 2. In brightness, or light, and 3. In detail. 4. How many common birds can you identify? How many kinds of trees, of wild flowers, of weeds? 5. Observe the work of an elementary school for the purpose of determining a. Whether the instruction in geography, nature study, agriculture, etc., calls for the use of the eyes, ears, and fingers. B. Whether definitions are used in place of first-hand information in any subjects. C. Whether the assignment of lessons to pupils includes work that would require the use of the senses, especially out of doors. D. Whether the work offered in arithmetic demands the use of the senses as well as the reason. E. Whether the language lessons make use of the power of observation. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Gary B. Clayton. Chapter 8 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary B. Clayton. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert Betts. Chapter 8, Mental Images and Ideas. As you sit thinking, a company of you together, your thoughts run in many diverse lines. Yet with all this diversity, your minds possess this common characteristic. Though your thinking all takes place in what we call the present moment, it goes on largely in terms of past experiences. 1. The part played by past experience. Present thinking depends on past experience. Image or ideas of things you have seen or heard or felt, of things you have thought of before and which now recur to you, of things you remember such as names, dates, places, events, of things that you do not remember as a part of your past at all, but that belong to it nevertheless. These are the things which form a large part of your mental stream, and which give content to your thinking. You may think of a thing that is going on now, or of one that is to occur in the future, but, after all, you are dependent on your past experience for the material which you put into your thinking of the present moment. Indeed, nothing can enter your present thinking which does not link itself to something in your past experience. The savage Indian in the primeval forest never thought about killing a deer with a rifle merely by pulling a trigger, or of turning a battery of machine guns on his enemies to annihilate them. None of these things were related to his past experience, hence he could not think in such terms. The present interpreted by the past. Not only can we not think at all except in terms of our past experience, but even if we could, the present would be meaningless to us, for the present is interpreted in the light of the past. The sedate man of affairs, who decries athletic sports and has never taken part in them, cannot understand the wild enthusiasm which prevails between rival teams in a hotly contested event. The fine work of art is to the one who has never experienced the appeal which comes through beauty, only so much of canvas and variegated patches of color. Paul says that Jesus was, "unto the Greeks, foolishness." He was foolishness to them because nothing in their experience with their own gods had been enough like the character of Jesus to enable them to interpret him. The future also depends on the past. To the mind incapable of using past experience, the future also would be impossible, for we can look forward into the future only by placing in its experiences the elements of which we have already known. The savage who has never seen the shiny yellow metal does not dream of a heaven whose streets are paved with gold, but rather of a "happy hunting ground." If you will analyze your own dreams of the future, you will see in them familiar pictures perhaps grouped together in new forms, but coming, in their elements, from your past experience nevertheless. All that would remain to a mind devoid of a past would be the little bridge of time which we call the present moment, a series of unconnected nows. Thought would be impossible, for the mind would have nothing to compare and relate. Personality would not exist, for personality requires continuity of experience, else we should be a new person each succeeding moment, without memory and without plans. Such a mind would be no mind at all. Rank determined by ability to utilize past experience. So important is past experience in determining our present thinking and guiding our future actions that the place of an individual in the scale of creation is determined largely by the ability to profit by past experience. The scientist tells us of many species of animals now extinct, which lost their lives and suffered their race to die out because when, long ago, the climate began to change and grow much colder, they were unable to use the experience of suffering in the last cold season as an incentive to provide shelter, or move to a warmer climate against the coming of the next and more rigorous one. Man was able to make the adjustment, and, providing himself with clothing and shelter and food, he survived, while myriads of the lower forms perished. The singed moth again and again dares the flame which tortures it, and at last gives its life, a sacrifice to its folly. The burned child fears the fire and does not, the second time, seek the experience. So also can the efficiency of an individual or a nation, as compared with other individuals or nations, be determined. The inefficient are those who repeat the same error or useless act over and over, or else fail to repeat a chance useful act whose repetition might lead to success. They are unable to learn their lesson and be guided by experience. Their past does not sufficiently minister to their present, and through it direct their future. 2. How past experience is conserved. Past experience conserved in both mental and physical terms. If past experience plays so important a part in our welfare, how then is it to be conserved so that we may secure its benefits? Here, as elsewhere, we find the mind and body working in perfect unison and harmony, each doing its part to further the interests of both. The results of our past experience may be read in both our mental and our physical nature. On the physical side, past experience is recorded in modified structure through the law of habit working on the tissues of the body, and particularly on the delicate tissues of the brain and nervous system. This is easily seen in its outward aspects. The stooped shoulders and bent form of the workman tell a tale of physical toil and exposure. The bloodless lips and pale face of the victim of the city sweatshop tell of foul air, long hours, and insufficient food. The rosy cheek and bounding step of childhood speak of fresh air, good food, and happy play. On the mental side, past experience is conserved chiefly by means of images, ideas, and concepts. The nature and function of concepts will be discussed in a later chapter. It will now be our purpose to examine the nature of images and ideas, and to note the part they play in the mind's activities. The image and the idea. To understand the nature of the image and then of the idea, we may best go back to the percept. You look at a watch which I hold before your eyes and secure a percept of it. Briefly, this is what happens. The light reflected from the yellow object on striking the retina results in a nerve current which sets up a certain form of activity in the cells of the visual brain area, and lo! A percept of the watch flashes in your mind. Now I put the watch in my pocket, so that the stimulus is no longer present to your eye. Then I ask you to think of my watch just as it appeared as you were looking at it, or you may yourself choose to think of it without my suggesting it to you. In either case, the cellular activity in the visual area of the cortex is reproduced approximately as it occurred in connection with the percept, and lo! An image of the watch flashes in your mind. An image is thus an approximate copy of a former percept or several percepts. It is aroused indirectly by means of a nerve current coming by way of some other brain center, instead of directly by the stimulation of a sense organ, as in the case of a percept. If, instead of seeking a more or less exact mental picture of my watch, you only think of its general meaning and relations, the fact that it is of gold, that it is for the purpose of keeping time, that it was a present to me, that I wear it in my left pocket, you then have an idea of the watch. Our idea of an object is, therefore, the general meaning of relations we ascribe to it. It should be remembered, however, that the terms image and idea are employed rather loosely, and that there is not yet general uniformity among writers in their use. All our past experience potentially at our command. Images may in a certain sense take the place of percepts, and we can again experience sights, sounds, tastes, and smells which we have known before, without having the stimuli actually present to the senses. In this way all our past experience is potentially available to the present. All the objects we have seen, it is potentially possible again to see in the mind's eye without being obliged to have the objects before us. all the sounds we have heard, all the tastes and smells and temperatures we have experienced, we may again have presented to our minds in the form of mental images without the various stimuli being present to the end organs of the senses. Through images and ideas, the total number of objects in our experience is infinitely multiplied. For many of the things we have seen, or heard, or smelled, or tasted, we cannot again have present to the senses, and without this power we would never get them again. And besides this fact, it would be inconvenient to have to go and secure afresh each sensation or percept every time we need to use it in our thought, while habit, then, conserves our past experience on the physical side, the image and the idea do the same thing on the mental side. 3. Individual differences in imagery. Images to be viewed by introspection. The remainder of the description of images will be easier to understand, for each of you can know just what is meant in every case by appealing to your own mind. I beg of you not to think that I am presenting something new and strange, a curiosity connected with our thinking which has been discovered by scholars who have delved more deeply into the matter than we can hope to do so. Every day, no, more than that, every hour and every moment, these images are flitting through our minds, forming a large part of our stream of consciousness. Let us see whether we can turn our attention within and discover some of our images in their flight. Let us introspect. I know of no better way to proceed than that adopted by Francis Galton years ago, when he asked the Englishmen of letters and science to think of their breakfast tables, and then describe the images which appeared. I am about to ask each of you to do the same thing, but I want to warn you beforehand that the images will not be so vivid as the sensory experiences themselves. They will be much fainter and more vague, and less clear and definite. They will be fleeting, and must be caught on the wing. Often the image may fade entirely out, and the idea only will be left. The varied imagery suggested by one's dining table. Let each one now recall the dining table as you last left it, and then answer questions concerning it like the following. Can I clearly see in my "mind's eye" the whole table as it stood spread before me? Can I see all parts of it equally clearly? Do I get the snowy white and gloss of the linen, the delicate coloring of the china, so that I can see where the pink shades off into the white, the graceful lines and curves of the dishes, the sheen of the silver, the brown of the toast, the yellow of the cream, the rich red and dark green of the bouquet of roses, the sparkle of the glassware? Can I again hear the rattle of the dishes, the clink of the spoon against the cup, the moving up of the chairs, the clatter of the voices, each with its own peculiar pitch and quality, the twitter of a bird outside the window, the tinkle of a distant bell, the chirp of a neighborly cricket? Can I taste clearly the milk, the coffee, the eggs, the bacon, the rolls, the butter, the jelly, the fruit? Can I get the appetizing odor of the coffee, of the meat, the oranges and bananas, the perfume of the lilac bush outside the door, the perfume from a handkerchief newly treated to a spray of heliotrope? Can I recall the touch of my fingers on the velvety peach, on the smooth skin of an apple, on the fretted glassware, the feel of the fresh linen, the contact of leather-covered or cane-seated chair, of the freshly donned garment? Can I get clearly the temperature of the hot coffee in the mouth, of the hot dish on the hand, of the ice water, of the grateful coolness of the breeze wafted in through the open window? Can I feel again the strain of muscle and joint in passing the heavy dish? Can I feel the movement of the jaws in chewing the beefsteak, of the throat and lips in talking, of the chest and diaphragm in laughing, of the muscles in sitting and rising, in hand and arm in using knife and fork and spoon? Can I get again the sensation of pain which accompanied biting on a tender tooth, from the shooting of a drop of acid from the rind of an orange into the eye, the chance ache in the head, the pleasant feeling connected with the exhilaration of a beautiful morning, the feeling of perfect health, the pleasure connected with partaking of a favorite food? Power of imagery varies in different people. It is more than probable that some of you cannot get perfectly clear images in all these lines, certainly not with equal facility, for the imagery from any one sense varies greatly from person to person. A celebrated painter was able, after placing his subject in a chair and looking at him attentively for a few minutes, to dismiss the subject and paint a perfect likeness of him from the visual image which recurred to the artist every time he turned his eyes to the chair where the sitter had been placed. On the other hand, a young lady, a student in my psychology class, tells me that she is never able to recall the looks of her mother when she is absent, even if the separation has been only for a few moments. She can get an image of the form, with the color and cut of the dress, but never the features. One person may be able to recall a large part of a concert through his auditory imagery, and another almost none. In general, it may be said that the power, or at least the use, of imagery decreases with age. The writer has made a somewhat extensive study of the imagery of certain high school students, college students, and specialists in psychology averaging middle age. Almost without exception it was found that clear and vivid images played a smaller part in the thinking of the older group than of the younger. More or less abstract ideas and concepts seem to have taken the place of the concrete imagery of earlier years. Imagery types. Although there is some difference in our ability to use imagery of different sensory types, probably there is less variation here than has been supposed. Earlier pedagogical work spoke of the visual type of mind, or the audible type, or the motor type, as if the possession of one kind of imagery necessarily rendered a person short in other types. Later studies have shown this view incorrect, however. The person who has good images of one type is likely to excel in all types, while one who is lacking in any one of the more important types will probably be found short in all. Most of us probably make more use of visual and auditory than of other kinds of imagery, while olfactory and gustatory images seem to play a minor role. 4. The functioning of images. Binet says that the man who has not every type of imagery almost equally well developed is only the fraction of a man. While this no doubt puts the matter too strongly, yet images do play an important part in our thinking. Images supply material for imagination and memory. Imagery supplies the pictures from which imagination builds its structures. Given a rich supply of images from the various senses, an imagination has the material necessary to construct times and events long since past, or to fill the future with plans or experiences not yet reached. Lacking images, however, imagination is handicapped, and its meager products reveal in their barrenness and their lack of warmth and reality the poverty of material. Much of our memory also takes the form of images. The face of a friend, the sound of a voice, or the touch of a hand may be recalled, not as a mere fact, but with almost the freshness and fidelity of a percept. That much of our memory goes on in the form of ideas instead of images is true. But memory is often both aided in its accuracy and rendered more vital and significant through the presence of abundant imagery. Imagery in the thought processes. Since logical thinking deals more with relations and meanings than with particular objects, images naturally play a smaller part in reasoning than in memory and imagination. Yet they have their place here as well. Students of geometry or trigonometry often have difficulty in understanding a theorem until they succeed in visualizing the surface or solid involved. Thinking in the field of astronomy, mechanics, and many other sciences is assisted at certain points by the ability to form clear and accurate images. The use of imagery in literature. Facility in the use of imagery undoubtedly adds much to our enjoyment and appreciation of certain forms of literature. The great writers commonly use all types of images in their description and narration. If we are not able to employ the images they used, many of their most beautiful pictures are likely to be to us but so many words suggesting prosaic ideas. Shakespeare, describing certain beautiful music, appeals to the sense of smell to make himself understood. Quote, "It came o'er my ear like the sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor." End quote. Lady Macbeth cries, quote, "Here's the smell of the blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand." End quote. Milton has Eve say of her dream of the fatal apple, quote, "The pleasant savory smell so quickened appetite that I, methought, could not but taste." End quote. Likewise with the sense of touch, quote, I take thy hand, this hand, as soft as dove's down, and as white as it. Imagine a person devoid of delicate tactile imagery, with senseless fingertips and leaden footsteps, undertaking to interpret these exquisite lines: "Thus I set my printless feet o'er the cowslip's velvet head, that bends not as I tread." Shakespeare thus appeals to the muscular imagery: "At last a little shaking of mine arm, and thrice his head thus waving up and down, he raised a sigh so piteous and profound, as it did seem to shatter all his bulk and end his being." Many passages like the following appeal to the temperate images: "Freeze, freeze, thou bitter sky! Thou dost not bite so nigh as benefits forgot." To one whose auditory imagery is meager, the following lines will lose something of their beauty: "How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank! Here we will sit and let the sounds of music creep in our ears. Soft stillness in the night becomes the touches of sweet harmony." Note how clear images will add to Browning's words: "Are there not two moments in the adventure of a diver? One when a beggar he prepares to plunge, and one when a prince he rises with his pearl." Points where images are of greatest service. Beyond question, many images come flooding into our minds which are irrelevant and of no service in our thinking. No one has failed to note many such. Further, we undoubtedly do much of our best thinking with few or no images present. Yet we need images. Where, then, are they most needed? Images are needed wherever the percepts which they represent would be of service. Whatever one better understand or enjoy or appreciate by seeing it, hearing it, or perceiving it through some other sense, he can better understand, enjoy, or appreciate through images than by means of ideas only. 5. The cultivation of imagery. Images depend on sensory stimuli. The power of imaging can be cultivated the same as any other ability. In the first place, we may put down as an absolute requisite such an environment of sensory stimuli as will tempt every sense to be awake and at its best, that we may be led into a large acquaintance with the objects of our material environment. No one's stock of sensory images is greater than the sum total of his sensory experiences. No one ever has images of sights, or sounds, or tastes, or smells, which he has never experienced. Likewise, he must have had the fullest and freest possible liberty in motor activities. For not only is the motor act itself made possible through the office of imagery, but the motor act clarifies and makes useful the images. The boy who has actually made a table, or a desk, or a box, has ever afterward a different and a better image of one of these objects than before. So also when he has owned and ridden a bicycle, his image of this machine will have a different significance from that of the image founded upon the visual perception alone of the wheel he longingly looked at through the store window or in the other boy's dooryard. The influence of frequent recall. But sensory experiences and motor responses alone are not enough, though they are the basis of good imagery. There must be frequent recall. The sunset may have been never so brilliant, and the music never so entrancing, but if they are never thought of and dwelt upon after they were first experienced, little will remain of them after a very short time. It is by repeating them often in experience through imagery that they become fixed, so they stand ready to do our bidding when we need next to use them. The reconstruction of our images. To richness of experience and frequency of the recall of our images we must add one more factor, namely, that of their reconstruction or working over. Few, if any, images are exact recalls of former percepts of objects. Indeed, such would be neither possible nor desirable. The images which we recall are recalled for a purpose, or in view of some future activity, and hence must be selective, or made up of the elements of several or many former related images. Thus the boy who wishes to construct a box without a pattern to follow recalls the images of numerous boxes he may have seen, and from them all he has a new image made over from many former percepts and images, and this new image serves him as a working model. In this way he not only gets a copy which he can follow to make his box, but he also secures a new product in the form of an image different from any he ever had before, and is therefore by so much the richer. It is this working over of our stock of old images into newer and richer and more suggestive ones that constitutes the essence of constructive imagination. The more types of imagery into which we can put our thought, the more fully it is ours and the better our images. The spelling lesson needs not only to be taken in through the eye, that we may retain a visual image of the words, but also to be recited orally, so that the ear may furnish an audible image, and the organs of speech a motor image of the correct forms. It needs also to be written, and thus given into the keeping of the hand, which finally needs most of all to know and retain it. The reading lesson should be taken in through both the eye and the ear, and then expressed by means of voice and gesture in as full and complete a way as possible, that it may be associated with motor images. The geography lesson needs not only to be read, but to be drawn, or molded, or constructed. The history lesson should be made to appeal to every possible form of imagery. The arithmetic lesson must be not only computed, but measured, weighed, and pressed into actual service. Thus we might carry the illustration into every line of education and experience, and the same truth holds. What we desire to comprehend completely and retain well, we must apprehend through all available senses and conserve in every possible type of image and form of expression. 6. Problems in introspection and observation. 1. Observe a reading class and try to determine whether the pupils picture the scenes and events they read about. How can you tell? 2. Similarly observe a history class. Do the pupils realize the events as actually happening and the personages as real, living people? 3. Observe in a similar way a class in geography and draw conclusions. A pupil in computing the cost of plastering a certain room based the figures on the room filled full of plaster. How might visual imagery have saved the error? 4. Imagine a 3-inch cube. Paint it. Then saw it up into 1-inch cubes, leaving them all standing in the original form. How many inch cubes have paint on 3 faces? How many on 2 faces? How many on 1 face? How many have no paint on them? Answer all these questions by referring to your imagery alone. 5. Try often to recall images in the various sensory lines. Determine in what classes of images you are least proficient and try to improve in these lines. 6. How is the singing teacher able, after his class has sung through several scores, to tell that they are flatting? 7. Study your imagery carefully for a few days to see whether you can discover your predominating type of imagery. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Gary B. Clayton.
Chapter 9 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert Betts. Chapter 9. Imagination. Everyone desires to have a good imagination, yet not all would agree as to what constitutes a good imagination. If I were to ask a group of you whether you have good imaginations, many of you would probably at once fall to considering whether you are capable of taking wild flights into impossible realms of thought and evolving unrealities out of airy nothings. You would compare yourself with great imaginative writers such as Stevenson, Poe, De Quincey, and judge your power of imagination by your ability to produce such tales as made them famous. 1. The place of imagination in mental economy. But such a measure for the imagination as that just stated is far too narrow. A good imagination, like a good memory, is the one which serves its owner best. If De Quincey and Poe and Stevenson and Bulwer found the type which led them into such dizzy flights the best for their particular purpose, well and good. But that is not saying that their type is the best for you, or that you may not rank as high in some other field of imaginative power as they in theirs. While you may lack in their particular type of imagination, they may have been short in the type which will one day make you famous. The artisan, the architect, the merchant, the artist, the farmer, the teacher, the professional man, all need imagination in their vocations not less than the writers need it in theirs, but each needs a specialized kind adapted to the particular work which he has to do. Practical nature of imagination. Imagination is not a process of thought which must deal chiefly with unrealities and impossibilities, and which has for its chief end our amusement when we have nothing better to do than to follow its wanderings. It is, rather, a commonplace, necessary process which illumines the way for our everyday thinking and acting, a process without which we think and act by haphazard chance or blind imitation. It is the process by which the images from our past experiences are marshaled and made to serve our present. Imagination looks into the future and constructs our patterns and lays our plans. It sets up our ideals and pictures us in the acts of achieving them. It enables us to live our joys and our sorrows, our victories and our defeats, before we reach them. It looks into the past and allows us to live with the kings and seers of old, or it goes back to the beginning and we see things in the process of the making. It comes into our present and plays a part in every act, from the simplest to the most complex. It is to the mental stream what the light is to the traveler who carries it as he passes through the darkness, while it casts its beams in all directions around him, lighting up what otherwise would be intolerable gloom. Imagination in the interpretation of history, literature, and art. Let us see some of the most common uses of the imagination. Suppose I describe to you the Battle of the Marne. Unless you can take the images which my words suggest and build them into struggling, shouting, bleeding soldiers, into forts and entanglements and breastworks, into roaring cannon and whistling bullet and screaming shell, unless you can take all these separate images and out of them get one great unified complex, then my description will be to you only so many words, largely without content, and you will lack the power to comprehend the historical event in any complete way. Unless you can read the poem and out of the images suggested by the words reconstruct the picture which was in the mind of the author as he wrote The Village Blacksmith or Snowbound, the significance will have dropped out, and the throbbing scenes of life and action become only so many dead words, like the shell of the chrysalis after the butterfly has left its shroud. Without the power of imagination, the history of Washington's winter at Valley Forge becomes a mere formal recital, and you can never get a view of the snow-covered tents, the wind-swept landscape, the tracks in the snow marked by the telltale drops of blood, or the form of the heartbroken commander as he kneels in the silent wood to pray for his army. Without the power to construct this picture as you read, you may commit the words, and be able to recite them, and to pass examination upon them, but the living reality of it will forever escape you. Your power of imagination determines your ability to interpret literature of all kinds, for the interpretation of literature is nothing, after all, but the reconstruction on our part of the pictures with their meanings which were in the mind of the writer as he penned the words, and the experiencing of the emotions which moved him as he wrote. Small use, indeed, to read the history of the centuries unless we can see in it living, acting people, and real events occurring in actual environments. Small use to read the world's great books unless their characters are to us real men and women, our brothers and sisters, interpreted to us by the master minds of the ages. Anything less than this, and we are no longer dealing with literature, but with words, like musical sounds which deal with no theme, or like picture frames in which no picture has been set. Nor is the case different in listening to a speaker. His words are to you only so many sensations of sounds of such and such pitches and intensities and quality, unless your mind keeps pace with his and continually builds the pictures which fill his thought as he speaks. Lacking imagination, the sculptures of Michelangelo and the pictures of Raphael are to you so many pieces of curiously shaped marble and ingeniously colored canvas. What the sculptor and the painter have placed before you must suggest to you images and thoughts from your own experience to fill out and make alive the marble and the canvas, else to you they are dead. Imagination and science. Nor is imagination less necessary in other lines of study. Without this power of building living, moving pictures out of images, there is small use to study science beyond what is immediately present to our senses. For some of the most fundamental laws of science rest upon conceptions which can be grasped only as we have the power of imagination. The student who cannot get a picture of the molecules of matter, infinitely close to each other and yet never touching, all in vibratory motion, yet each within its own orbit, each a complete unit in itself, yet capable of still further division into smaller particles. The student who cannot see all this in a clear visual image can never at best have more than a most hazy notion of the theory of matter. And this means finally that the explanations of light and heat and sound and much besides will be to him largely a jumble of words which linger in his memory perchance, but which never vitally become a possession of his mind. So with the world of the telescope. You may have at your disposal all the magnificent lenses and the accurate machinery owned by modern observatories. But if you have not within yourself the power to build what these reveal to you, and what the books tell you, into the solar system and still larger systems, you can never study astronomy except in a blind and piecemeal sort of way, and all the planets and satellites and suns will never for you form themselves into a system, no matter what the books may say about it. Everyday uses of imagination. But we may consider a still more practical phase of imagination, or at least one which has more to do with the humdrum daily life of most of us. Suppose you go to your milliner and tell her how you want your spring hat shaped and trimmed, and suppose you have never been able to see this hat in toto in your mind, so as to get an idea of how it will look when completed, but have only a general notion, because you like red velvet, white plumes, and a turned-up rim, that this combination will look well together. Suppose you have never been able to see how you would look in this particular hat with your hair done in this or that way. If you are in this helpless state, shall you not have to depend finally on the taste of the milliner, or accept the model, and so fail to reveal any taste or individuality on your own part? How many times have you been disappointed in some article of dress, because when you planned it you were unable to see it all at once so as to get the full effect, or else you could not see yourself in it and so be able to judge whether it suited you? How many homes have in them draperies and rugs and wallpaper and furniture which are in constant quarrel because someone could not see before they were assembled that they were never intended to keep company? How many people who plan their own houses would build them just the same again after seeing them completed? The man who can see a building complete before a brick has been laid or a timber put in place, who can see it not only in its details, one by one as he runs them over in his mind, but can see the building in its entirety, is the only one who is safe to plan the structure. And this is the man who is drawing a large salary as an architect, for imaginations of this kind are in demand. Only the one who can see in his mind's eye before it is begun the thing he would create is capable to plan its construction. And who will say that ability to work with images of these kinds is not of just as high a type as that which results in the construction of plots upon which stories are built? The building of ideals and plans. Nor is the part of the imagination less marked in the formation of our life's ideals and plans. Everyone who is not living blindly and aimlessly must have some ideal, some pattern by which to square his life and guide his actions. At some time in our life I am sure that each of us has selected the person who filled most nearly our notion of what we should like to become, and measured ourselves by this pattern. But there comes a time when we must idealize even the most perfect individual, when we invest the character with attributes which we have selected from some other person, and thus worship at a shrine which is partly real and partly ideal. As time goes on, we drop out more and more of the strictly individual element, adding correspondingly more of the ideal, until our pattern is largely a construction of our own imagination, having in it the best we have been able to glean from the many characters we have known. How large a part these ever-changing ideals play in our lives we shall never know, but certainly the part is not an insignificant one, and happy the youth who is able to look into the future and see himself approximating some worthy ideal. He has caught a vision which will never allow him to lag or falter in the pursuit of the flying goal which points the direction of his efforts. Imagination and conduct. Another great field for imagination is with reference to conduct and our relations with others. Over and over again the thoughtless person has to say, "I am sorry, I did not think." The "did not think" simply means that he failed to realize through his imagination what would be the consequences of his rash or unkind words. He would not be unkind, but he did not imagine how the other would feel. He did not put himself in the other's place. Likewise with reference to the effects of our conduct on ourselves. What youth, taking his first drink of liquor, would continue if he could see a clear picture of himself in the gutter with bloated face and bloodshot eyes a decade hence? Or what boy, slyly smoking one of his early cigarettes, would proceed if he could see his haggard face and nerveless hand a few years farther along? What spendthrift would throw away his money on vanities, could he vividly see himself in penury and want in old age? What prodigal anywhere who, if he could take a good look at himself, sin-stained and broken as he returns to his father's house after the years of debauchery in the far country, would not hesitate long before he entered upon his downward career? Imagination and thinking. We have already considered the use of imagination in interpreting the thoughts, feelings, and handiwork of others. Let us now look a little more closely into the part it plays in our own thinking. Suppose that instead of reading a poem, we are writing one. Instead of listening to a description of a battle, we are describing it. Instead of looking at the picture, we are painting it. Then our object is to make others who may read our language, or listen to our words, or view our handiwork, construct the mental images of the situation which furnished the material for our thought. Our words and other modes of expression are but the description of the flow of images in our minds, and our problem is to make a similar stream flow through the mind of the listener. But strange indeed would it be to make others see a situation which we ourselves cannot see. Strange if we could draw a picture without being able to follow its outlines as we draw. Or suppose we are teaching science, and our object is to explain the composition of matter to someone, and make him understand how light, heat, etc. depend on the theory of matter. Strange if the listener should get a picture if we ourselves are unable to get it. Or, once more, suppose we are to describe some incident, and our aim is to make its every detail stand out so clearly that no one can miss a single one. Is it not evident that we can never make any of these images more clear to those who listen to us or read our words than they are to ourselves? 2. The material used by imagination. What is the material, the mental content, out of which imagination builds its structures? Images, the stuff of imagination. Nothing can enter the imagination, the elements of which have not been in our past experience and then been conserved in the form of images. The Indians never dreamed of a heaven whose streets are paved with gold, and in whose center stands a great white throne. Their experience had given them no knowledge of these things, and so perforce they must build their heaven out of the images which they had at command, namely those connected with the chase and the forest. So their heaven was the happy hunting ground, inhabited by game and enemies over whom the blessed forever triumphed. Likewise the valiant soldiers whose deadly arrows and keen-edged swords and battle-axes won on the bloody field of Hastings did not picture a far-off day when the opposing lines should kill each other with mighty engines hurling death from behind parapets a dozen miles away. Firearms and the explosive powder were yet unknown, hence there were no images out of which to build such a picture. I do not mean that your imagination cannot construct an object which has never before been in your experience as a whole, for the work of the imagination is to do precisely this thing. It takes the various images at its disposal, and builds them into wholes which may never have existed before, and which may exist now only as a creation of the mind. And yet we have put into this new product not a single element which was not familiar to us in the form of an image of one kind or another. It is the form which is new, the material is old. This is exemplified every time an inventor takes the two fundamental parts of a machine, the lever and the inclined plane, and puts them together in relations new to each other, and so evolves a machine whose complexity fairly bewilders us. And with other lines of thinking, as in mechanics, inventive power consists in being able to see the old in new relations, and so constantly build new constructions out of old material. It is this power which gives us the daring and original thinker, the Newton whose falling apple suggested to him the planets falling toward the sun in their orbits, the Darwin who out of the thigh bone of an animal was able to construct in his imagination the whole animal and the environment in which it must have lived, and so add another page to the earth's history. The two factors in imagination. From the simple facts which we have just been considering, the conclusion is plain that our power of imagination depends on two factors, namely, 1. The materials available in the form of usable images capable of recall, and 2. Our constructive ability, or the power to group these images into new wholes, the process being guided by some purpose or end. Without this last provision, the products of our imagination are daydreams with their castles in Spain, which may be pleasing and proper enough on occasions, but which as an habitual mode of thought are extremely dangerous. Imagination limited by stock of images. That the mind is limited in its imagination by its stock of images may be seen from a simple illustration. Suppose that you own a building made of brick, but you find the old one no longer adequate for your needs, and so purpose to build a new one. And suppose further that you have no material for your new building except that contained in the old structure. It is evident that you will be limited in constructing your new building by the material which was in the old. You may be able to build the new structure in any one of a multitude of different forms or styles of architecture, so far as the material at hand will lend itself to that style of building, and providing further that you are able to make the plans. But you will always be limited finally by the character and amount of the material obtainable from the old structure. So with the mind. The old building is your past experience, and the separate bricks are the images out of which you must build your new structure through the imagination. Here, as before, nothing can enter which is not already on hand. Nothing goes into the new structure, so far as its constructive material is concerned, except images, and there is nowhere to get images but from the results of our past experience. Limited also by our constructive ability. But not only is our imaginative output limited by the amount of material in the way of images which we have at our command, but also, and perhaps not less, by our constructive ability. Many persons might own the old pile of bricks fully adequate for the new structure, and then fail to get the new because they were unable to construct it. So, many who have had a rich and varied experience in many lines are yet unable to muster their images of these experiences in such a way that new products are obtainable from them. These have the heavy draught horse kind of intellect which goes plodding on, very possibly doing good service in its own circumscribed range, but destined after all to service in the narrow field with its low drooping horizon. They are never able to take a dash at a 2-minute clip among equally swift competitors, or even swing at a good round pace along the pleasant highways of an experience lying beyond the confines of the narrow here and now. These are the minds which cannot discover relations, which cannot think. Minds of this type can never be architects of their own fate, or even builders, but must content themselves to be hod carriers. The need of a purpose. Nor are we to forget that we cannot intelligently erect our building until we know the purpose for which it is to be used. No matter how much building material we may have on hand, nor how skillful an architect we may be, unless our plans are guided by some definite aim, we shall be likely to end with a structure that is fanciful and useless. Likewise with our thought structure. Unless our imagination is guided by some aim or purpose, we are in danger of drifting into mere daydreams, which not only are useless in furnishing ideals for the guidance of our lives, but often become positively harmful when grown into a habit. The habit of daydreaming is hard to break, and continuing holds our thought in thrall and makes it unwilling to deal with the plain, homely things of everyday life. Who has not had the experience of an hour or a day spent in a fairyland of dreams, and awakened at the end to find himself rather dissatisfied with the prosaic round of duties which confronted him? I do not mean to say that we should never dream, but I know of no more pernicious mental habit than that of daydreaming carried to excess, for it ends in our following every will-o'-the-wisp of fancy, and places us at the mercy of every chance suggestion. 3. Types of imagination. Although imagination enters every field of human experience, and busies itself with every line of human interest, yet all its activities can be classed under two different types. These are 1. Reproductive, and 2. Creative imagination. Reproductive imagination. Reproductive imagination is the type we use when we seek to reproduce in our minds the pictures described by others, or pictures from our own past experience which lack the completeness and fidelity to make them true memory. The narration or description of the storybook, the history or geography text, the tale of adventure recounted by traveler or hunter, the account of a new machine or other invention, fairy tales and myths, these or any other matter that may be put into words capable of suggesting images to us are the field for reproductive imagination. In this use of the imagination, our business is to follow and not lead, to copy and not create. Creative imagination. But we must have leaders, originators, else we should but imitate each other and the world would be at a standstill. Indeed, every person, no matter how humble his station or how humdrum his life, should be in some degree capable of initiative and originality. Such ability depends in no small measure on the power to use creative imagination. Creative imagination takes the images from our own past experience, or those gleaned from the work of others, and puts them together in new and original forms. The inventor, the writer, the mechanic, or the artist who possesses the spirit of creation is not satisfied with mere reproduction, but seeks to modify, to improve, to originate. True, many important inventions and discoveries have come by seeming accident, by being stumbled upon. Yet it holds that the person who thus stumbles upon the discovery or invention is usually one whose creative imagination is actively at work seeking to create or discover in his field. The world's progress as a whole does not come by accident, but by creative planning. Creative imagination is always found at the van of progress, whether in the life of an individual or a nation. 4. Training the imagination. Imagination is highly susceptible of cultivation, and its training should constitute one of the most important aims of education. Every school subject, but especially such subjects as deal with description and narration, history, literature, geography, nature study, and science, is rich in opportunities for the use of imagination. Skillful teaching will not only find in these subjects a means of training the imagination, but will so employ imagination in their study as to make them living matter, throbbing with life and action, rather than so many dead words or uninteresting facts. Gathering of material for imagination. Theoretically, then, it is not hard to see what we must do to cultivate our imagination. In the first place, we must take care to secure a large and usable stock of images from all fields of perception. It is not enough to have visual images alone or chiefly, for many a time shall we need to build structures involving all the other senses and the motor activities as well. This means that we must have a first-hand contact with just as large an environment as possible, large in the world of nature with all her varied forms suited to appeal to every avenue of sense, large in our contact with people in all phases of experience, laughing with those who laugh and weeping with those who weep, large in contact with books, the interpreters of the men and events of the past. We must not only let all these kinds of environment drift in upon us as they may chance to do, but we must deliberately seek to increase our stock of experience. For after all, experience lies at the bottom of imagination as of every other mental process. And not only must we thus put ourselves in the way of acquiring new experience, but we must by recall and reconstruction, as we saw in an earlier discussion, keep our imagery fresh and usable. For whatever serves to improve our images at the same time is bettering the very foundation of imagination. We must not fail to build. In the second place, we must not fail to build, for it is futile to gather a large supply of images if we let the material lie unused. How many people there are who put in all their time gathering material for their structure and never take time to do the building? They look and listen and read and are so fully occupied in absorbing the immediately present that they have no time to see the wider significance of the things in which they deal. They are like the students who are too busy studying to have time to think. They are so taken up with receiving that they never perform the higher act of combining. They are the plodding fact-gatherers, many of them doing good service, collecting material which the seer and the philosopher, with their constructive power, build together into the greater wholes which make our systems of thought. They are the ones who fondly think that by reading books full of wild tales and impossible plots, they are training their imagination. For them, sober history, no matter how heroic or tragic in its quiet movements, is too tame. They have not the patience to read solid and thoughtful literature, and works of science and philosophy are a bore. These are the persons who put in all their time in looking at and admiring other people's houses, and never get time to do any building for themselves. We should carry our ideals into action. The best training for the imagination which I know anything about is that to be obtained by taking our own material and from it building our own structure. It is true that it will help to look through other people's houses enough to discover their style of building. We should read. But just as it is not necessary for us to put in all the time we devote to looking at houses in inspecting doll houses and Chinese pagodas, so it is not best for us to get all our notions of imaginative structures from the marvelous and the unreal. We get good training for the imagination from reading Hiawatha, but so can we from reading the history of the primitive Indian tribes. The pictures in Snowbound are full of suggestion for the imagination, but so is the history of the Puritans in New England. But even with the best of models before us, it is not enough to follow others building. We must construct stories for ourselves, must work out plots for our own stories. We must have time to meditate and plan and build, not idly in the daydream, but purposefully, and then make our images real by carrying them out in activity, if they are of such a character that this is possible. We must build our ideals and work to them in the common course of our everyday life. We must think for ourselves, instead of forever following the thinking of others. We must initiate as well as imitate. 5. Problems for observation and introspection. 1. Explain the cause and the remedy in the case of such errors as the following. Children who defined mountain as land 1,000 or more feet in height said that the factory smokestack was higher than the mountain because it went straight up and the mountain did not. Children often think of the horizon as fastened to the earth. Islands are thought of as floating on the water. 2. How would you stimulate the imagination of a child who does not seem to picture or make real the descriptions in reading, geography, etc.? Is it possible that such inability may come from an insufficient basis in observation, and hence in images? 3. Classify the school subjects, including domestic science and manual training, as to their ability to train 1. Reproductive and 2. Creative imagination. 4. Do you ever skip the descriptive parts of a book and read the narrative? As you read the description of a bit of natural scenery, does it rise before you? As you study the description of a battle, can you see the movements of the troops? 5. Have you ever planned a house as you think you would like it? Can you see it from all sides? Can you see all the rooms in their various finishings and furnishings? 6. What plans and ideals have you formed, and what ones are you at present following? Can you describe the process by which your plans or ideals change? Do you ever try to put yourself in the other person's place? 7. Take some fanciful unreality which your imagination has constructed, and see whether you can select from it familiar elements from actual experiences. 8. What use do you make of imagination in the common round of duties in your daily life? What are you doing to improve your imagination? End of Chapter 9. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Chapter 10 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio, InterfaceAudio.com. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert Betts, Chapter 10. Associations in Thinking. All thinking proceeds by the discovery or recognition of relations between the terms or objects of our thought. The science of mathematics rests on the relations found to exist between numbers and quantities. The principles and laws of natural science are based on the relations established among the different forms of matter and the energy that operates in this field. So also in the realm of history, art, ethics, or any other field of human experience. Each fact or event must be linked to other facts or events before it possesses significance. Association therefore lies at the foundation of all thinking, whether that of the original thinker who is creating our sciences, planning and executing the events of history, evolving a system of ethics, or whether one is only learning these fields as they already exist by means of study. Other things being equal, he is the best thinker who has his knowledge related part to part, so that the whole forms a unified and usable system. Association and action. Association plays an equally important part in all our motor responses. The acts by which we carry on our daily lives, do our work and our play, or whatever else may be necessary in meeting and adapting ourselves to our environment. Some sensations are often repeated and demand practically the same response each time. In such cases, the associations soon become fixed, and the response certain and automatic. For example, we sit at the table, and the response of eating follows, with all its complex acts, as a matter of course. We lie down in bed, and the response of sleep comes. We take our place at the piano, and our fingers produce the accustomed music. It is, of course, obvious that the influence of association extends to moral action as well. In general, our conduct follows the trend of established associations. We are likely to do in great moral crisis about as we are in the habit of doing small ones. 2. The types of association. Fundamental law of association. Stated on the physiological side, the law of habit set forth in the definition of association in the preceding section includes all the laws of association. In different phrasing, we may say, 1. Neuron groups accustomed to acting together have the tendency to work in unison. 2. The more frequently such groups act together, the stronger will be the tendency for one to throw the other into action. Also, 3. The more intense the excitement or tension under which they act together, the stronger will be the tendency for activity in one to bring about the activity in the other. The corresponding facts may be expressed in psychological terms as follows. 1. Facts accustomed to being associated together in the mind have a tendency to reappear together. 2. The more frequently these facts appear together, the stronger the tendency for the presence of one to ensure the presence of the other. 3. The greater the tension, excitement, or concentration when these facts appear in conjunction with each other, the more certain the presence of one is to cause the presence of the other. Several different types of association have been differentiated by psychologists, from Aristotle down. It is to be kept in mind, however, that all association types go back to the elementary law of habit connections among the neurons for their explanation. Association by contiguity. The recurrence in our minds of many of the elements from our past experience is due to the fact that at some time, possibly at many times, The recurring facts were contiguous in consciousness with some other element, or fact, which happens now to be again present. All have had the experience of meeting some person whom we had not seen for several months or years, and having a whole series of supposedly forgotten incidents or events connected with our former associations flood into the mind. Things we did, topics we discussed, trips we took, games we played, now recur at the renewal of our acquaintance. For these are the things that were contiguous in our consciousness, with our sense of the personality and appearance of our friend. And who has not, in similar fashion, had a whiff of perfume or the strains of a song recall to him his childhood days? Contiguity is again the explanation. At the mercy of our associations. Through the law thus operating, we are in a sense at the mercy of our associations, which may be bad as well as good. We may form certain lines of interest to guide our thought, and attention may in some degree direct it, but one's mental make-up is, after all, largely dependent on the character of his associations. Evil thoughts, evil memories, evil imaginations, these all come about through the association of unworthy or impure images along with the good in our stream of thought. We may try to forget the base deed and banish it forever from our thinking. But lo, in an unguarded moment the nerve current shoots into the old path, and the impure thought flashes into the mind, unsought and unwelcomed. Every young man who thinks he must indulge in a little sowing of wild oats before he settles down to a correct life, and so deals in unworthy thoughts and deeds, is putting a mortgage on his future, for he will find the inexorable machinery of his nervous system grinding the hated images of such things back into his mind as surely as the mill returns to the sack of the miller what he feeds into the hopper. He may refuse to harbor these thoughts, but he can no more hinder their seeking admission to his mind than he can prevent the tramp from knocking at his door. He may drive such images from his mind the moment they are discovered, and indeed is guilty if he does not, but not taking offense at this rebuff, the unwelcome thought again seeks admission. The only protection against the return of the undesirable associations is to choose lines of thought as little related to them as possible. But even then, do the best we can, an occasional connection will be set up. We know not how, and the unwelcome image stands staring us in the face, as the corpse of Eugene Aram's victim confronted him at every turn, though he thought it safely buried. A minister of my acquaintance tells me that in the holiest moments of his most exalted thought, images rise in his mind which he loathes, and from which he recoils in horror. Not only does he drive them away at once, but he seeks to lock and bar the door against them, by firmly resolving that he will never think of them again. But alas, that is beyond his control. The tares have been sown among the wheat, and will persist along with it until the end. In his boyhood these images were given into the keeping of his brain cells, and they are only being faithful to their trust. Association by similarity and contrast. All are familiar with the fact that like tends to suggest like. One friend reminds us of another friend when he manifests similar traits of character, shows the same tricks of manner, or has the same peculiarities of speech or gesture. The telling of a ghost or burglar story in a company will at once suggest a similar story to every person of the group, and before we know it, the conversation has settled down to ghosts or burglars. One boastful boy is enough to start the gang to recounting their real or imaginary exploits. Good and beautiful thoughts tend to call up other good and beautiful thoughts, while evil thoughts are likely to produce after their own kind. Like produces like. Another form of relationship is, however, quite as common as similars in our thinking. In certain directions we naturally think in opposites. Black suggests white, Good suggests bad. Fat suggests lean. Wealth suggests poverty. Happiness suggests sorrow, and so on. The tendency of our thought thus to group in similars and opposites is clear when we go back to the fundamental law of association. The fact is that we more frequently assemble our thoughts in these ways than in haphazard relations. We habitually group similars together or compare opposites in our thinking. Hence, these are the terms between which associative bonds are formed. Partial or selective association. The past is never wholly reinstated in present consciousness. Many elements, because they had formed fewer associations, or because they find some obstacle to recall, are permanently dropped out and forgotten. In other words, association is always selective, favoring now this item of experience, now that, above the rest. It is well that this is so, for to be unable to escape from the great mass of minutiae and unimportant detail in one's past would be intolerable, and would so cumber the mind with useless rubbish as to destroy its usefulness. We have surely all had some experience with the type of persons whose associations are so complete and impartial that all their conversation teems with unessential and irrelevant details. They cannot recount the simplest incident in its essential points, but slaves to literalness make themselves insufferable bores by entering upon every lane and bypath of circumstance that leads nowhere and matters not the least in their story. Dickens, Thackeray, George Eliot, Shakespeare, and many other writers have seized upon such characters and made use of them for their comic effect. James, in illustrating this mental type, has quoted the following from Miss Austen's Emma. "But where could you hear it?" cried Miss Bates. "Where could you possibly hear it, Mr. Knightley? For it is not 5 minutes since I received Mrs. Cole's note. No, it cannot be more than 5, or at least 10, for I had got my bonnet and spencer on, just ready to come out. I was only gone down to speak to Patty again about the pork. Jane was standing in the passage, were not you, Jane? For my mother was so afraid that we had not any salting pan large enough. So I said I would go down and see, and Jane said, 'Shall I go down instead? For I think you have a little cold, and Patty has been washing the kitchen.' 'Oh, my dear,' said I. Well, and just then came the note." The remedy. The remedy for such wearisome and fruitless methods of association is, as a matter of theory, simple and easy. It is to emphasize, intensify, and dwell upon the significant and essential in our thinking. The person who listens to a story, who studies a lesson, or who is a participant in any event, must apply a sense of value, recognizing and fixing the important, and relegating the trivial and unimportant to their proper level. Not to train oneself to think in this discriminating way is much like learning to play a piano by striking each key with equal force. 3. Training in association. Since association is at bottom nothing but habit at work in the mental processes, it follows that it, like other forms of habit, can be encouraged or suppressed by training. Certainly no part of one's education is of greater importance than the character of his associations. For upon these will largely depend not alone the content of his mental stream, the stuff of his thinking, but also its organization, or the use made of the thought material at hand. In fact, the whole science of education rests on the laws and principles involved in setting up right systems of associative connections in the individual. The pleasure-pain motive in association. A general law seems to obtain throughout the animal world that associative responses, accompanied by pleasure, tend to persist and grow stronger, while those accompanied by pain tend to weaken and fall away. The little child of 2 years may not understand the gravity of the offense in tearing the leaves out of books, but if its hands are sharply spatted whenever they tear a book, the association between the sight of books and tearing them will soon cease. In fact, all punishment should have for its object the use of pain in the breaking of associative bonds between certain situations and wrong responses to them. On the other hand, the dog that is being trained to perform his tricks is rewarded with a tidbit or a pat when the right response has been made. In this way, the bond for this particular act is strengthened through the use of pleasure. All matter studied and learned under the stimulus of good feeling, enthusiasm, or a pleasurable sense of victory and achievement not only tends to set up more permanent and valuable associations than if learned under opposite conditions, but it also exerts a stronger appeal to our interest and appreciation. The influence of mental attitude on the matter we study raises a question as to the wisdom of assigning the committing of poetry or Bible verses, or the reading of so many pages of a literary masterpiece, as a punishment for some offense. How many of us have carried away association of dislike and bitterness toward some gem of verse or prose or scripture, because of having our learning of it linked up with the thought of an imposed task set as penance for wrongdoing? One person tells me that to this day she hates the sight of Tennyson, because this was the volume from which she was assigned many pages to commit in atonement for her youthful delinquencies. Interest as a basis for association. Associations established under the stimulus of strong interest are relatively broad and permanent, while those formed with interest flagging are more narrow and of doubtful permanence. This statement is, of course, but a particular application of law of attention. Interest brings the whole self into action. Under its urging, the mind is active and alert. The new facts learned are completely registered and are assimilated to other facts to which they are related. Many associative connections are formed, hence the new matter is more certain of recall and possesses more significance and meaning. Association and methods of learning. The number and quality of our association depends in no small degree on our methods of learning. We may be satisfied merely to impress what we learn on our memory, committing it uncritically as so many facts to be stored away as a part of our education. We may go a step beyond this and grasp the simplest and most obvious meanings, but not seek for deeper and more fundamental relations. We may learn separate sections or divisions of a subject, accepting each as a more or less complete unit, without connecting these sections and divisions into a logical whole. But all such methods are a mistake. They do not provide for the associative bonds between the various facts or group of facts in our knowledge, without which our facts are in danger of becoming but so much lumber in the mind. Meanings, relations, definitely recognized associations should attach to all that we learn. Better far a smaller amount of usable knowledge than any quantity of unorganized and undigested information, even if the latter sometimes allows us to pass examinations and receive honor grades. In short, real mastery depends that we think, that is, relate and associate, instead of merely absorbing as we learn. 4. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. Test the uncontrolled associations of a group of pupils by pronouncing to the class some word, as blue, and having the members write down 20 words in succession as rapidly as they can, taking in each instance the first word that occurs to them. The difference in the scope or range of association can easily be studied by applying this test to, say, a 4th grade and an 8th grade, and then comparing the results. 2. Have you ever been puzzled by the appearance in your mind of some fact or incident not thought of before for years? Were you able to trace out the associative connection that caused the fact to appear? Why are we sometimes unable to recall, when we need them, facts that we perfectly well know? 3. You have observed that it is possible to be able to spell certain words when they occur in a spelling lesson, but to miss them when employing them in composition. It is possible to learn a conjugation or a declension in tabular form, and then not be able to use the correct form of words in speech or writing. Relate these facts to the laws of association, and recommend a method of instruction that will remove the discrepancy. 4. To test the quickness of association in a class of children, copy the following words clearly in a vertical column on a chart. Have your class all ready at a given signal. Then display the chart before them for 60 seconds, asking them to write down on paper the exact opposite of as many words as possible in 1 minute. Be sure that all know just what they are expected to do. Bad, inside, slow, short, little, soft, black, dark, sad, true, dislike, poor, well, sorry, thick, full, peace, few, below, enemy. Count the number of correct opposites got by each pupil. Can you think of garrulous persons among your acquaintance, the explanation of whose tiresomeness is that their association is of the complete instead of the selective type? Watch for such illustrations in conversation and in literature. For example, Juliet's nurse. Observe children in the schoolroom for good and poor training in association. Have you ever had anything that you otherwise presumably would enjoy rendered distasteful because of unpleasant associations? Pass your own methods of learning in review, and also inquire into the methods used by children in study, to determine whether they are resulting in the best possible use of association. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio. InterfaceAudio.com.